Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre live. Tonight, we're very lucky to have Rodge Glass with us. Rodge is Senior Lecturer in Creative Writing at Strathclyde University. He's a novelist, an editor, and a prize-winning author of biographies of Alasdair Gray and Michelle Faber. His latest book, Joshua in the Sky, is somewhat more personal. It's a family memoir and a memorial to a short life. Rodge, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, David. And hi, everybody. I appreciate you all logging on. This is a little bit special for me because this is the first proper event I've done for this book anywhere. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be doing a lot of them, but this is the first, and my first copy of the book has just arrived through the post as well, which is handy, or else I would have had to read it by heart, and I don't know it off by heart. So I'm going to just introduce the book extremely briefly. We're going to get into it in more detail and chat with myself and David in a moment. But in brief, the book is a mixture of autobiography and biography. And I've drawn on the experience that I've had in writing about real people in the past, well-known people, private figures, to try and work through what happened with my nephew Joshua. He and I are linked by this rare genetic blood condition called HHT, which no doubt we'll get into talking about. But this first 2 pages of the book, I think, gives a decent introduction into what the questions of the book are. So rather than explain it all and then read it, I'm just going to read it. So this is from the very beginning. It's called On Waves. Okay. On Waves. Around 2 a.m., something woke me and I drifted to the bathroom. My eyes were barely open. I reached for my phone, swaying in the dark, scrolling, while the rest of the family slept in rooms close by. I was thinking about my daughters, the positions they sleep in, the wee hamster smell in their rooms at night when they dream of who knows what. Cows and pigs, says Cora with a grin, though she's performing, knowing the answer makes me smile. I was myself then. Between waking and sleeping, I was me. Guilty, convinced, incapable of seeing anything except that I'd been meaning well for years, though there are no prizes for meaning well, and you can still do damage even without meaning it. It's harder to say whether I was me or not after that. I'm trying to describe what happens in these slices of time when the HHT waves come. I've always called them waves, though perhaps they're more like a slippage from one perspective to another, or a sinking into a kind of mud with no name. Though they're nameless, I've known them for as long as I can remember. Though they surprise me every time, I know them better than I know myself. At some point while scrolling, I started to rub my eyes. I was trying to scratch an itch, one just out of reach of my knuckle or behind my eyeball, and soon I was rubbing harder as I could, like I was launching an attack, and the attack was all that mattered, scraping round the edges of my eyes, scratching across the lids, then rubbing again, this time with fists clenched. It comes on so suddenly that I don't know it's happening until it's already washed over me. That's what I tell people if they ask, that it's an ambush. Sometimes I'm asked, "Are you okay?" And I'll say, "Why would you ask that? I'm fine." Only realizing as my mouth forms the words that I'm lying. It's possible to be present and absent at the same time. It was 3 years since Joshua was born, and I became certain his death was my fault. I didn't know how long I'd been in the bathroom, but I didn't want to leave. It was a kind of break from existence, a powerful, ugly freedom. While it was happening, I was thinking about the photos, poems, and figures in the book of Joshua Jonah, which we were given after Joshua died by his parents. Excuse me, sniffle, sniffle. I might have a nosebleed. If I do, that would be very on brand for me. But anyway, we'll deal with it should it happen. I was saying to David before, I'm daring the nosebleed by wearing a white shirt. I'll go back slightly. While it was happening, I was thinking about the photos, poems, and figures in the book of Joshua Jonah, which we were given after Joshua died by his parents. I was thinking about the rabbi who taught me Bible stories in primary school, his neatly clipped beard, the movement of his hands as he talked about Jonah in the belly of the whale, praying God would answer his prayers and see him safely out into the world. How in those days we supported Judaism like the religion was one single big team, one under constant threat of extinction. I was also thinking about the nurse who leaned into the corridor on seeing my recent blood test results, bellowing, "Nita, love, get over here and look at this. Full bingo card, eh?" How she turned back towards me, cocked her head to one side, ran her gloved hand down my shredded arm and patted me like a dog. "Ah, love," she said, "you're just allergic to the world." On my bathroom floor, I was at Joshua's graveside and far from it, with the nurse, the rabbi, and no one, in the moment and out of it. Joshua was dead because I had nosebleeds for years and never got a diagnosis, though I must have known it was HHT, because HHT is genetic and it's in our family. Joshua was dead because I could have researched my condition, discovering you can have it without having symptoms, which means you can pass it on. I could have said to my brother, "Watch out." Then IVF could have stopped it all. It all seems so obvious. That's enough for now, I think.
So thanks very much, Rodge. There's a lot to think about there. You had nosebleeds for years. Other people in your family as well. I think your mother had nosebleeds as well.
Yeah.
So what did you think that was all about? Did you have any idea?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think I was probably partially in denial about it, but also there was very little information out there. I mean, like, as with lots of, rare conditions, I think it's understandable to an extent, but what I'm trying to do here is take responsibility for what I could have done. And as an adult, I definitely could have been more proactive. So that was kind of the trigger for me feeling so convinced, at least at the beginning of the book, of my own guilt. Yes, my mum is probably the one in the family with the worst symptoms. And she gets very heavy nosebleeds a lot. And we knew she had HHT. Her mother and her mother before her, though I didn't know them, they wouldn't have used that term. It used to be called Osler-Weber syndrome. But very little was known about it. And around the time that I was young, sometimes we would check my tongue looking for blood spots because it was thought back then that a sign of having HHT, the defining sign would be if you had raised blood capillaries on your tongue. So we were always quite relieved in checking my tongue and that I didn't seem to have them, and my brother didn't either. But the way that it can sometimes be with HHT is that it gets worse as you get older, or actually your middle years can be the worst. Excuse me. And so it was really only when I started getting into my 20s and late 20s and early 30s that it started to become more serious, more insistent, and it seemed to be more important to get a diagnosis.
So was there a sense when you were growing up of maybe your family saying, "Look, don't worry about this. It's not anything serious"?
I don't think those words were ever said, but it was definitely we didn't know it could kill, and we knew very little about it. I think the average lag, even now, between when people are born, have HHT and find out they've got HHT, the average lag is about 27 years, and about 90% of people who've got it don't know they've got it. So my story is incredibly common in that way. But it wasn't so much that we thought, don't worry about it, or you've definitely not got it, but just that all we saw was nosebleeds, really. And I didn't really think any further past that, and I should have done. Also, my mum is incredibly, remains to this day, like incredibly active, very, very able. She was working 3 jobs when we were growing up, and nosebleeds didn't seem to stop her doing anything. On the contrary, she was very, very focused, worked really hard, very can do, very much kind of get up and get on with it. And I inherited some of that, I think. I think I'm a little bit like that as well. Yeah, I think that's probably the best answer that I can give. But I didn't think about it as seriously as I should have done in my younger adult years, when really it was obvious. I mean, once I started having serious nosebleeds of my own, it was very unlikely to be anything else. Yeah.
So, just getting to the subject of guilt, you say that started quite a bit after Joshua had died, that you began to feel that you were personally in some way responsible.
Yeah, to me, it all seemed incredibly straightforward. I mean, I should say that my family were incredibly supportive and very respectfully disagreed with me. There's a bit in the book where I'm having a phone conversation with my brother walking around a park in Glasgow, and he says, it's not just that they don't agree with me, they didn't even really understand my logic, but to me, the logic all seemed very straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like it was my responsibility as soon as Joshua died.
Okay.
And then that was with me really for 5 years. It's funny now talking about it because I don't feel burdened by it in that way. And in some way, actually, writing the book has helped me come through it because um, the process of facing the thing and then trying to do something positive, which is making a book which is a memorial that records that life and does it in a way that's not just purely tragic or purely sentimental or just self-flagellation. I didn't want to do that. But the process of doing that means that combined with the fact that I've done this with my family's consent and collaboration at every single stage, I feel morally at peace with it and don't feel like I'm in amongst all of that now. But for about 5 years, I did, and pretty much as soon as Joshua died, because I just felt like the stakes were always there. The internet exists. We could have known. And because I was the one that had the most obvious symptoms and didn't get diagnosed, I just felt like it was really obvious that that was my responsibility.
Raj, I think your default position is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to write about other writers and their work,
Yeah.
and also encourage other people to write and to encourage their writing. So I don't know if you have done a lot of autobiographical writing, but I'm interested to know when you started writing this book. And did you know it was going to be a book, or did you just start writing random thoughts or whatever?
Yeah, I can give a clear answer to that, and it's Zoom based, at least partially, and lockdown based. But there are two things going on there, really. The first one is about like, did I initially know that it was a book? No. It was that's seen on waves is in the bathroom in the early days of lockdown when I'm scrolling through the phone. I'm scrolling looking for WHO statistics and realizing that we're all going to be stuck inside for the foreseeable. And it was a very, as everybody knows, it was a very destabilizing and strange time anyway. But that just seemed to be a crystallizing moment in which just the weight of this nosebleed seemed incredibly obvious and undeniable, and that I had to face something that was really about how the choices I'd made in my life and about storytelling and writing about other storytellers. So that's the second part. I should come back to that in a minute. But initially, all I did was wanted to write one essay for me. And I didn't know how Joshua's parents would feel about it. I certainly didn't think that anybody would necessarily be interested in publishing it. I have a sort of curious writerly history, and although I've now written quite a lot of books, I wrote lots of things within a decade, and then after my children were born, not because of my children, but after my children were born, I slowed down quite a lot. And although I wrote lots of smaller things, I hadn't had a book for quite a while actually. And at the time, I was writing the book about Michelle Faber and the one about Joshua at the same time, but was doing it in a vacuum really. And a very good friend of mine, Alan Bissett, who I've a great Falkirk writer who I've known for over 20 years, he suggested that we start up a writing group during lockdown, as many people did, just as a way to connect with each other and to, find a way of coping and keeping in contact, but also making something out of it. So I initially started showing them the first couple of bits. I showed a couple of essays to Joshua's mum, and she could immediately see, even in her grief, and I was, I'm obviously a much smaller part of this than she is and always will be, but even in her grief, she could see that this was part of my grieving process. And so she supported that right from the beginning. And then what we did was to incrementally, bit by bit, publish small sections of it in which I felt like I was starting to see how it might take shape as a bigger project, but also getting the family used to and me used to the idea of being this exposing about my own life. Once there were 5 or 6 pieces done and I'd published several, then all of a sudden it seemed like it was a more possible thing. And then I won the Anne Brown Prize for one of the chapters around the time that we got a deal for the book. So that's the first part of the answer. It happened incrementally, and you have to build genuine trust over time. That's the same with all of my nonfiction work. You can't pretend that away or just rush it. It has to be built and it has to be genuine. So incrementally was how it happened. Yes, a lot of my work is about other storytellers, and I had, up until the point where Joshua died, spent a lot of my adult life reading and writing and thinking about what reading and writing does to people, how the role that storytelling plays in our communities and our cultures, it being absolutely fundamental to every culture that exists, and thinking that this was an essential thing to be doing. And as soon as Joshua died, it just seemed suddenly like it was an incredible waste of time. And that what I'd done with my life up until that point was to basically hide from the real world and things that could have been practically useful and could have saved Joshua's life, and hidden away in stories instead. Now, the point that I come to by the end of the book is a realization of something more nuanced, and I do feel like my time in reading and writing has been valuable, and it's the only skill that I have, and it allows me to write a biography of Joshua's life, so that's pretty concrete. But as the chapters go on, what I'm doing bit by bit is to sort of try to face that nagging fear that it's all been a waste of time, and to try to interrogate what is it that's always intrigued me about storytelling, and how do the stories of others help us understand our own lives better. That's really what moved me into nonfiction in the first place. I mean, I started out writing traditional Jewish family drama novels. Those were my first two books were that. And it was only on writing Alasdair Gray's biography that suddenly I thought, oh, maybe I'm better at this. So I'm quite interested in it, and writing real lives in an ethical way. I promise you I'm nearly finished with this long answer, but the one other thing that I wanted to say, that'll teach you to ask a question. But one other thing I wanted to say was that you'd asked about how much I'd written autobiography since. This is much, much more exposed. And you have a different persona for each book, I think. And for the Alasdair Gray biography, I was really young. I was his secretary. I was essentially the butt of the jokes. I made myself that. I was Boswell. And all of my role in the book was not really about how I felt. It was about how to serve Alasdair's personality and to record it. That book initially was twice the size, and it had loads of diary entries in it about me, and we just cut them all out in the end. So I had been in the habit of writing in a more exposed way about myself, but had never really published that way. And with the Michelle Faber book, that was much more academic. There are one or two other examples of where I've written about my children for audio stories for the BBC, which I'm really keen to talk about. But basically, this is the most exposed.
I've had the good fortune to read the book before publication, and just to explain to everybody, one of the interesting things about it is it's quite different from just a straight autobiography, because every chapter you talk about other writers and books that you've enjoyed reading, and somehow that poses lots of questions, like the questions of, as you've said, what's the point of stories? What's the point of being a storyteller? What's the point of reading, etc.? And so there's a kind of there's a lovely sort of juggling thing going on, where there seems to be lots of stories happening throughout the book in a way. And as I said to you when we talked a few days ago, I felt, as I was reading the book, that it was also a meditation. And one of the questions that you ask is, whose life is worth remembering or writing about?
Yeah, there's two things there, I think. First of all, I've spent most of my life writing about people who've had lots of attention. And so that's a different kind of challenge. Somebody who's already chosen to be a public figure. How do you make sense of that life? What do you include in the frame? What do you cut out? What do you foreground? What do you background? Every one of those creative decisions is a kind of reshaping. It's artificial. It can still be real, but it's artificial. And so the question of how to fairly and morally represent a private life that would otherwise go completely unseen is a very different kind of challenge. Part of the reason why that needed to be done through storytelling was partially because the book forced me to return to my own Jewish community in a way that I hadn't for quite a while. And I don't need to tell you, the very heart of community is storytelling. A rabbi will tell a story every Shabbat in shul. We are constantly telling ourselves stories about our community and our culture and our faith. And there has never been a society that's got by without using storytelling in order to understand itself. What I was trying to do is select not just stories, but also works of art and people and memories and songs and pictures, things that would help me make sense of the world around me. There's a great Glaswegian poet who I quote in the book called David Kinloch, and he says, that poetry is like a conductor of being. And I've always found that the twin acts of reading and writing are like a conductor of being. They help us make sense of and feel connected to the world around us. And sometimes that can feel like a kind of marginal thing. But actually, if we don't feel connected to the world around us, we're free floating, we're lost. And at the time that I was writing this book, I was completely lost. And so in a sense, although I was doubting the value of a lot of those stories, I also needed them more than ever.
Bereavement is something that, to an extent, bereavement affects everybody eventually, I think.
Yes.
And where do you turn in these moments? And it certainly seems that not just in bereavement, but in confusion, perhaps, your solace is in reading. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think of reading now as a way of reading the twin acts of reading and writing. I think of them as a way of hiding from and facing the world at the same time. So you need to retreat in order to read a book, or to read a story, or to listen to an audio story or something, or to watch a story on screen, on TV or on film. They're all just different types of storytelling. So you need to somehow leave the world in order to do it, but you're also allowing yourself a way of facing the world that gets you closer than you would otherwise be. So that means that, lots of simple but really magical ways, you are brought closer to the experiences that you cannot possibly have. So I use the classic example of Maya, and this character I love in The Cart by a story by Anton Chekhov. And that's in one of the chapters in Joshua in the Sky. She's just an ordinary school teacher on the back of a cart in 19th century Russia who feels that life can't offer her anything new and that her life is a repetition. And you do not have to be a woman, Russian, in the 19th century, a teacher, or going through the field in a cart in order to be able to connect with her experience and to feel like you feel for her. And yet by the end of the story, she's alive again, inside and outside. And as readers, we feel transformed. If the story works, that's what it does. And I find it completely mesmerizing. But so storytelling allows us to be people and places and times and cultures that otherwise would be closed off to us. Michelle Faber says, literature reminds us of our specialness and our commonality. So everybody is individual. Everyone in this Zoom room now is individual, and their experience is unlike anybody else's on planet Earth ever, before or after now. And yet also it can be true that we all have something in common. And storytelling of all kinds allows that possibility. You'll know that better than most, the work that you've done. So the more that I was writing these essays, the more I felt like I was developing an idea of something that I actually believed, rather than just being lost. I thought, I can explain this to myself and to other people. Right. So storytelling is useful after all. It's not just a complete indulgent waste of time that I have spent my entire life hiding in and trying to earn money through in order to have to engage with planet Earth in any meaningful way. What can I do with this? And then I was talking to Joshua's mum, and she said, I put it in the epigraph at the beginning of the book, it is every bereaved parent's worst fear that their child will be forgotten. So I thought, well, what can I do in order to do something productive so I don't feel so guilt-ridden and pointless, but also use the skills that I've got, that I've learned from writing about the real lives of other people in what I think is an ethical way. And the answer to that was make something that's not only tragic, that's true and that hurts, but that also contains positivity, that can talk about a short life with a long legacy, a memorial, a kind of portrait. And I find it quite hard to imagine now, having been through that I would ever again think, oh, what's the point in storytelling? Because the very fact that this book is published, even though, even if nobody buys it, and you all should 20 at a time, please. But even if nobody buys it, it's done what it was intended to do, which is to make impossible the idea that this child could be forgotten and go unseen, because we made a book out of it and it belongs to the family, to all of us.
I think, again, reading the book, there are lots of people's stories in the book. I mean, obviously yours, but also Joshua's and his parents and his family. And I think one of the things that you bring out is the way we remember people is humanity.
Yes.
And humour as well. Yes. Yeah. And I have to say, there were some episodes in your life that you talk about to do with your nosebleeds and other health issues that were actually very funny, and
Yeah, I mean, often the darkest things can be
and,
hilarious.
and actually, before this evening, just before the audience came in, our guests, we were talking, and Rodge mentioned to myself and Janet the possibility that he might have a nosebleed because he has them every day virtually. He's got a white shirt on, right? And actually, for the last couple of days, I've been thinking about that.
Right, okay.
So he created a drama already, which is both kind of serious but can funny as well.
I mean, it can be both. I'm a great believer that it can be both. It can be you can be deadly serious and also be joking at the same time. One of my favorite scenes in the book is me having an asthma attack and in this ambulance on the way to Kirkcaldy Hospital, where they're like the five Morecambe and Wise that were the ambulance crew. They were absolutely brilliant, hilarious they were. And then we got stuck outside the hospital because there were no beds because of COVID, and everybody was just sitting there for hours and hours and hours. And there was this odd mixture of gallows humour because there was really something at stake, but also sort of genuine connection, and mostly people connect through humour, and I always have. One of my favourite bits of the book is when and maybe I couldn't talk about this in every event that I do on the talk, but maybe this is a good place for it. That there's an article in the Jewish Telegraph in 1988. I'm 10 years old and I'm being interviewed alongside 3 other children at my Jewish primary school, and I was really pompous. I think I definitely spoke over the girls. I mean, that sounds like something that I would do, and I'm really sorry, whoever you are, wherever you are. But the article was in the Jewish newspaper, and it was about what Jewish children go on to do after being at Orthodox primary school, and whether they should be going on to Jewish schools or remaining tightly in the Jewish community, or whether it's a benefit to be in the wider community. And this is within the context of the fact that, and we can get into this if you like, but I have a very complicated Jewish family history myself and was somewhat distanced, shall we say, gently for some years before Joshua died, and I was forced to re-engage with the Jewish community and to admit that I absolutely loved his rabbi, and that rather changed things for me. I quite like that. It proved to me that I had my own ideas and prejudices that needed to be challenged. But anyway, so perhaps we could have seen it coming, because in the Jewish Telegraph in 1988, I was asked about my experience of being at a Jewish primary school, and although the greatest rabbis over thousands of years of Jewish experience have found Judaism an inexhaustible resource, I, at 10 years old, felt like I knew everything that I needed to know, and I was off to other horizons. I started telling this interview with this poor fellow who must have thought, oh my God, what a stuck-up, self-important child. But essentially, I just wanted out. I wanted other experiences and other people's stories and basically any other culture, and I felt like I was straitjacketed by this thing. So there's something that's integral about the humour in the book that's connected to my own Jewishness, I think, but also is a portal to be able to talk about things that are really, really hard to talk about, but are much easier done with humour. So in the chapter that I'm going to read shortly from Joshua's little brother's birth and bris, we absolutely needed the humour there. I mean, that's a comical event anyway, but. Yeah.
So I was going to say, well, this was where I was heading, because I wanted to talk with you about your relationship with your faith and Judaism.
Let's do that.
But if you want to go ahead with the reading first, then that's fine.
Well, why don't we talk about that a little bit, and then what you were just going to ask, just for a moment or two, if that's okay, and then I'll come to the reading. I think it might be useful the other way around. Is that okay?
Yeah. So you say you moved away from Judaism, not just when you got to secondary school, but I guess later in life when you were.
I moved to Scotland when I was 19, so that's why I don't have the accent. Accent was pretty set by the time I arrived, and just to give an idea, so there were 6 cousins in my family, all in South Manchester. My parents were from Orthodox communities in North Manchester, and all of the other 5 grandchildren all went to London and had families there and are still there and have remained there and are part of that same community. And I was the awkward bugger that went as far as I could go in the opposite direction. And I knew very, very little about Glasgow before I came, except that I just wanted to get away. And then very quickly fell in love with the culture, writers, art, music, made friends, and felt like it was something that I could throw myself into. Now, of course, I wouldn't have thought about it in these terms at the time because I was a teenager, but essentially I was looking to leave something behind that I had some level of discomfort with and throw myself into something new. And what I threw myself into was Scottish literature. And all these writers and artists and people that are essential here, but that just weren't part of my education in England. Writers and artists that might be considered to be major in this country, Scotland, were no part of my education in England, and certainly not part of my Jewish education. I'm part of the process of writing Joshua in the Sky is trying to come to some kind of acceptance of my own Jewishness, particularly with my own daughters. And again, there's nothing that I'm unprepared to talk about. I can maybe come to it a little bit more in detail after the reading or in questions if people are interested. But essentially it was a matter of looking for somewhere new to start again, although I don't think I thought about it like that at the time. Of course, Judaism is a coded thing. Any one of us that are Jewish can get on a train, and maybe some of the people on that train, without speaking to you, will immediately know that you're Jewish, or at least suspect it, just from the look, movements, if they hear you talking, your language. I use my hands a lot. There are all kinds of giveaways. We're constantly revealing ourselves, but then others might not know at all and might never be able to guess. So it's sometimes a hidden thing, but it's not connected, I feel, necessarily to how observant you are or how you feel about God or, how regularly you're in synagogue. You just either are Jewish or you're not. We don't advertise, you are or you're not. And the older that I've got, the more I've realized that people see me as Jewish no matter what I do. So I need to be at peace with it. And that's in fact brought me a little bit closer to coming back to being comfortable in a way. I don't want to die uncomfortable with it. You only get one life. I'd rather work things out as I go. And so in a way, this book has been a gift in those terms as well.
Interesting. And there's a connection between Glasgow, you talking about being Jewish, and one of your favourite writers, Alasdair Gray.
Yes. Because
I grew up going to a show, a synagogue called Cross Hill, which was a tiny show, and it had this it was almost like a rather large hut in some way. But it had this very almost surreal mural on the whole ceiling. Was it's very interesting sort of painting mural. Now, I didn't know at the time, but it was painted by someone called Alasdair Gray, who is a young artist.
Yeah, David, I'm so jealous of you that I never saw that in person, but there's a picture of it in my biography of Alasdair Gray. And do you know what? The rabbis of Cross Hill Synagogue were the very first people anywhere to pay Alasdair Gray for a mural. Although it didn't last for very long, I still want to find out more about how long it lasted for. But that building's now called the Annex on the south side.
Yes.
And we don't know whether the mural is underneath there or not still.
Well, the show lasted 25 years.
Right, okay.
And both my parents were involved on the Ladies of the Gents Committee. And I believe,
Was the mural there that whole time?
Yeah.
I mean, that's extraordinary. And he did just a cloudscape, right? Because in Judaism...
It's a sort of cloudscape with stars and various things. Yeah. It's very colourful. Mm. And dare I say it, during the service on a Saturday morning, occasionally I was just looking up at that when I didn't understand what the prayer was, or I was just bored or whatever.
How very dare you. You must come into the Alasdair Gray archive and record what it was like to look up at that mural. I was never there. I was always jealous. And there are all kinds of rumours about it. Alasdair misremembered what had happened to the mural as well, and all kinds of things that have sort of become myth over time. But he used that cloudscape, the approach to doing clouds, which he developed partly because he couldn't put in figures in a synagogue in the same way that he could in a church. And he then developed those cloudscapes and then used them in his later books and used them again in Oran Moore, which is now the biggest free-to-access artwork in Scotland. So that was, an integral part of the culture of the city, and integral in Alasdair's development as an artist. It's amazing, really. And almost all of those murals were knocked down when Glasgow changed, when the motorway was put in and the city sort of destroyed itself in all sorts of fascinating ways. He did the 7 Days of Creation mural. It took him 4 years at Bridgeton Church, and then it got knocked down because the motorway was going to come through it. And this is the most tragic bit, then they didn't put the motorway there. They put the motorway somewhere else, and they didn't need to destroy it, but they did. So, lots of those murals are lost. Others have been recovered, or he recycled ideas or images from there. But I would love to have been in that synagogue when the cloudscape was there. I have only seen one black and white photograph.
So just coming back to your Judaism, so was it really the case that until Joshua's death, you didn't really engage again? And what was it about the rabbi that made you, that stirred something in you?
Okay, so yeah, I'm quite keen to talk about that. So my parents were both Orthodox from North Manchester, moved south, and then at the time you couldn't remain Orthodox after you got divorced. So both sides of the family went into Reform Judaism, and that's where I had my bar mitzvah. But pretty much all of the family was from the Orthodox tradition. Both my parents remarried when I was really young, and are still with the same people now, two great people. And one converted to Judaism, my stepmom, and the other, my stepdad, didn't, but he attended everything with my mum, and she remained part of her community. But not everybody in the family accepted the non-Jewish members of the family. And so from very young, I kind of associated my Jewish identity with something that I didn't think of as accepting. So many, many years later, when it came to sort of returning to seeing Orthodox Judaism close up in moments of great stress and strain, I came to that with various assumptions about what it would be like, that I was carrying from my primary school from decades earlier and from my experience as a child. And not only were those things very out of date, but also, of course, that doesn't allow for the great variety of different kinds of approaches in different parts of Jewish communities. And so it was a little bit of a shock to me to find that I just thought that Joshua's rabbi was the most amazing, inspiring, uplifting, generous, inclusive, articulate, person I could imagine meeting. And I say in the book that I know that he had other jobs apart from being Joshua's rabbi, but as far as I was concerned, that was his full-time permanent job. He was Joshua's rabbi. I might even read from that bit shortly. And if you have stood at somebody's graveside while hearing a rabbi try and make sense for a very intimate group of people of what has happened, I think that's very hard to let go of. And not everybody can rise to that moment. It's almost an impossible thing to do. It's a hell of a high wire act in grief in any way. Never mind when it's a newborn child. And Joshua didn't live for 8 days. So I didn't know and didn't assume that he would be, included or accepted or named or anything. And Joshua's rabbi went hugely out of his way to always include Joshua in anniversaries and things afterwards. And that made a big difference to the family. But during Joshua's funeral, when I was standing behind my brother with my hand on his shoulder, I write about this in the book, and the rabbi had to carry us all through that. And it was an almost impossible thing to do. The older I get, the more I have respect for people that are able to hold people together in times of grief, or to make sense in language, essentially in storytelling, of what we're doing here. What are we doing here? And that was just staggering to me. Also, any community leader can set the tone for an event. And that can have a huge impact on then how you see that thing. I could imagine somebody else might have presented Joshua's life and death purely in tragic terms. And it's not that Joshua's rabbi hid from that, but that he also made a point of talking about legacy and things that were positive and what we could learn from what had happened to him, and the fact that, those lessons stay with us and then affect the decisions we take in the future. That's something that really appeals to me. That's when my antennae went up. I thought, okay, right? So we don't have to hide from something or be in denial about it in order to improve our lives and to see how it can sustain us. You know? So from the funeral on to the anniversaries and in lockdowns when Joshua's rabbi had to do the services by Zoom, he had a couple of his children, you know, banging the drums either side and helping him sing the songs and things. And these are all songs that I felt a deep past connection to, but had been away from a long time and had never, because I always found that if I didn't believe in every word that I was saying, I always felt like I shouldn't say it. Some people seem to wear these things lightly, but anytime I could see the English next to the Hebrew, and I thought, well, what if I don't mean that? And I always felt it got stuck in my throat, you know. But being able to see in context Joshua included in amongst these services, that at once reminded me of something that I left behind and also showed me how I might be a little bit more comfortable being it in the future. That's what it was.
Again, very interesting, because Judaism encourages us obviously to study, but also be in the world.
Yes.
And so going out into the world is important, and
Yes.
And yet community is important, and the, you know, obviously the people of all faiths and none who are just able to find the right words and create empathy at times when we most need it.
Yeah.
And not least the ambulance crew in Fife. You know?
The ambulance crew are great. I've got to just say one daft thing about them. So one of the two ambulance crew was an Olympic fencer for Scotland who was in her 20s, and she was just constantly having to fend off the older guys who kept making jibes at her. But the older guy, who was in his 60s, told me a story of how one day he was giving CPR to somebody who was having a heart attack. And while he was trying to save someone else have a heart attack, he started to have a heart attack of his own. So he had to step away and just say calmly to somebody, I think I'm going to need a minute here. You know, and then he was off work for 3 weeks, and then he was back. I can't remember why I started talking about that, but anyway, it seemed important at the time.
Well, I encourage anyone to read that chapter in the book, and you'll get the full story. So, do you want to give us another
Yes.
reading, Rodge?
If I'm going to put a small light on behind me, so I promise you I'm not going anywhere, but I can see it's completely black behind me. So in this scene, this was called On the Covenant, and in this chapter, I am watching the bris by Zoom of Joshua's little brother, and part of the tension in the scene is that we all know, although it is unstated, that at some point, my brother, Joshua's dad, is going to mention Joshua in the speech, and this adds a charge to what is already a charged event. I think anyone that's been at a Brit Milah will recognise that. But I was too worried. Basically, I was too worried that I would be too emotional at the bris if I went, and I was uncomfortable with circumcision in the first place. So I wasn't entirely sure how I would be if I went. But what we agreed, because my brother was completely reasonable and didn't get upset with me at all, or if he did, he hid it very well. He just said, well, people are joining in Zoom as well as in the room. Why don't you join on Zoom and then come down to London and then meet my new nephew, who's Joshua's little brother. So that's what I did. Excuse me from sniffling. Right, so I'm in a cafe and I'm crying in a cafe and I can't stop crying. And there's a little boy at a table across from me with his mum. And at this point, I'm quite glad that I'm not in the room, because partly what I was worried about was just making it all about me. If anybody's ever been at a family event or a public event of some kind where emotion is just welling up inside you, you don't feel like you have any control over it. Even if that's a genuine thing, you know that it draws attention to you. And the last thing I wanted to do was to draw any attention to myself. And so I felt safer not being there. But still, by not being there, I also felt like I I was somehow letting them down. Anyway, all I could think about were the other tables of customers in the cafe. The young boy at a nearby table looking at me, asking his mummy why that man across there couldn't stop crying. The boy seemed to be sitting too close, I thought. I'm now one of those people who cries all the time. You can't take me anywhere. At the moment, I realised I wasn't going to be able to stop. I went into a state that reminded me of that last asthma attack when I didn't trust myself to breathe in and out. What was I doing? Why wasn't I there in person? Why couldn't I just show up? I imagined my brother sitting down at the seat opposite me, putting a hand over mine and saying, "Bruv, this is getting embarrassing. Even for you, this is a bit mad."
But of course, he was in London, having been perfectly reasonable about me saying I'd be more comfortable coming down after the service, if he didn't mind. When we discussed it, I didn't quite say, "you people."
I didn't really feel superior to these traditions. I don't feel superior to much at all. Though still, I couldn't just hold my breath and be there. I told myself it was the tears, that really it was nothing to do with circumcision at all, rather that I simply being feared by surrounded by all that family. In the presence of a new baby boy, unable to stop myself crying about Joshua, being a downer on a day of joy, making it all about me. At some point, I heard the Mohel say the word Yosef, a Hebrew word meaning to add. I thought, everyone thinks I'm crazy. I thought, I'm not even a decent uncle to my living nieces and nephews. At some point, I heard the word Chaim, which is Hebrew for life. At some point, I heard the word Tuvia, which is Joshua's dad's Hebrew name. It landed and I whooped to the canvas. I gripped the sides of the cafe table with my fingers and lowered my head, as if that would stop the boy in the cafe staring. All this happened before anyone even said the word Joshua, though of course it was coming. His dad always makes a speech. The speech is always, in part,
but he whose name
must be spoken again and again. At any time it might go unmentioned, his spirit whispering in ears all around the room. So, you've forgotten me already. I'll stop there. I think I will go and get another tissue, but now I'll be fine. I'm really sorry to people on the Zoom that I'm sniffling, but I'll be back in a moment. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. Not to worry. We'll have a commercial break. Thank you. I hope everyone's enjoying the evening. As I've said before, it's a really wonderful and moving book to read, and there is lots of humour in it as well.
I'm okay.
You're okay? Okay.
I'm absolutely fine. Yeah, I think it's stopped now. It's funny how rarely that actually happens when I'm reading or when I'm in front of students at the university. It's almost like the body knows sometimes just not to do it, but maybe it knows what I'm talking about now, so it's responding.
So one of the things that you've talked about is the need to remember, the need to keep Joshua's name with us, and also make people aware of HHT.
Yes.
And that's something that his parents...
Definitely. Yeah. So I should say a little bit more directly about it, I suppose. So there is only one book that exists anywhere that I know of about HHT. You know a book is academic when it says PhD on the front. And this is a book by Dr. Sarah Palmer, PhD. It's called Living with HHT, and it's like a scientific handbook about how to cope with the condition. It's not so much about people's experiences or about how it affects families or the story of anybody that's had it. And my feeling is that part of the worth of the book is in being able to, just like we can with anything that is, scientific or challenging or about illness or disability, perhaps, human beings tend to connect with the story emotionally if they can invest in the story of somebody who's got that thing. Whereas you might be able to give a lot of facts, scientific facts about a story, but if you can't write it in a way that helps us to feel close to the person's experience, it's a lot more difficult. And so I felt that was something that I could do. So this is the first book published anywhere in Europe about HHT in any way, shape or form. And the all of the profits from the book and all author fees, including for tonight, and anything that I make from the process. Also, the Anne Brown Prize that I won, the advance I got from the publisher, all of that is going to 2 places, one of which is Cure HHT, which I'll explain in a second. And the other one is UCLH, the fetal unit that cared for Joshua before and after he died, which is an agreement with Joshua's parents. So it's partially about raising money for those 2 particular places. Cure HHT is like the world hub in Chicago for research and funding in order to be able to try and find a cure for HHT. And the other thing is raising awareness, which again, I'm hoping to work with the people at Cure HHT and do things in the US online and give talks and do community groups and things like that. They're a way of being able to use, again, that skill of storytelling and thinking about how we make sense of the experiences we've had, because it's not unique to HHT. Any family with any kind of rare condition or illness will want to connect with other people often far away that have had that experience. There are loads of those on the planet. That's why there's multiple Facebook groups for all of these things everywhere. You know, we need to reach out. There's a human need to reach out to other people who have a similar experience to us. And also, one thing that I found already, just from doing the initial interviews for press for this book, is that every person that I speak to shares with me an experience from their own family that is completely different to HHT, but is also in some way about loss or about grief or about learning about health and conditions and how we cope with them. So those are all aims of the book. I try not to think too much about exactly what, success would look like there, and just try and have a principle about the way we go about it and then do it as well as possible. It's partly why I'm doing so many events for the book, a lot more than I would usually do for any of my others, I think. So one thing I haven't explicitly said yet is that what I'm doing throughout the book is working towards an idea of something positive that I can do in Joshua's name that is memorial to a short life, that isn't only about grief, but that also contains positive legacy. And in a very short life, the question of the book is, how do you represent that life fairly and truly without just simply making it sentimental or mawkish or, grief-stricken and awful? And in the end, what I chose to do with the support of Joshua's parents was to make the final chapter of the book a mini biography that starts at the moment that we find out that my sister-in-law is pregnant and finishes years after Joshua dies, after we've seen lots and lots of ways in which Joshua's legacy has played out. And the most difficult part of that was doing the hours where he was alive, because I wasn't in the room. I was on my way to the hospital with my dad in the car after Joshua died. But I was, hundreds of miles away when I heard that he died, so I never met him. So I had to patch that together with the support of both Joshua's parents and the records that we had, and also the photographs that they were encouraged to take in the room at the time. And I'm just going to finish with something that is intended to be a little bit more positive. There are, of course, lots of bits of this that are just really difficult to think about and to read. But it's nice to be able to think for this whole project, really, in terms of the magic trick which I'm trying to perform again and again, which is, every time that you remember somebody in your own life, this isn't about my family, it could be about any of yours. Anytime we tell a story about somebody in our lives that we've lost, in our communities, in our families, friends, then we bring them back to life in a sense. That's how I feel about it. And a large part of this book and every event that I do will be about having the joy of being able to bring Joshua back to life. But in amongst many of these bits, which are quite raw, there are some just utterly ordinary things that anyone who's ever had a child or ever been in a family with a child coming can relate to about different stages of pregnancy. 9 weeks before Joshua was born, we learned that he had a kind of HHT that made it very unlikely that when he was born, he'd be able to breathe on his own. And so we all knew that we would have to prepare for this. Those were 9 very long weeks for everybody. But this is about a page and a half to finish off with, to give you a sense of what that was like, and it finishes at the moment that he was born, which is a moment of hope and acceptance. Until full term, there are many days to wait. Once you realise you can't magic or research away the danger, what do you do with the time? Joshua's mum and dad try to relax, though how can you? A minute is a long time. A week is a long time. They try to remain positive, though what must go through your mind? Life must carry on. Work must carry on. Time does not care for any one of us, our small tragedies or joys, our worries or preoccupations, and it refuses to hurry up or slow down. It's going to do what it's going to do. Joshua's mum and dad book a weekend away, but in the end, they're too scared to be too far away, just in case the worst happens, so they have to stay close by. They book a hotel near to the hospital and hold their breath. Joshua's mum describes it as proof of his strength that he makes it to full term at all, a strength everyone wants to believe in, his aunts and uncles, his grandparents on all sides. They decide on the name Joshua. There's nothing else they like, nothing that sounds right for their son, and after some consideration they go for Jonah as a middle name. That one comes with the weight of history for Jews. After all, Joshua's got a book all of his own. His story sees him sent to Nineveh by God on a mission before being swallowed by a large fish. Somehow, Jonah must survive floating in its belly through nights and through days in the hope that God will respond to his prayers and see him safely out into the world. It's a kind of birth and extreme circumstances. As part of the plan to give Joshua the best chance of survival, a caesarean section has been booked for March the 28th, but Joshua is ready 2 days early. He waits until his dad leaves home at 3 a.m. on the 26th, a Sunday, Mother's Day, where today he is supposed to be working remotely with colleagues from Australia from an office in London. After his dad leaves for work in the dark of the spring night, Joshua lets his mum read for a couple of hours. Then she falls asleep around 5 a.m. She wakes once more at 8 a.m. and realises her waters are broken. She can't reach Joshua's dad on the phone. He must be in a meeting. So she sends him a WhatsApp instead, like many other partners must be doing at that moment across borders and seas. I've gone into labour. There's nothing unusual about the message, nothing that signifies worry or concern. It's just a mother telling a father, it's time, as mothers have been doing for as long as there have been families. He replies, are you joking? Then moves. Joshua's mum phones the labour ward and they all tell her to come in straight away. Her brother races round to pick her up and take her to the hospital in his car, while Joshua's dad makes his way there from work as quickly as he can. Joshua, awake on Mother's Day, laughing at everyone's plans, doing his own thing, regardless. On arrival at the hospital, the team is ready. Midwives, obstetricians, anaesthetists, fetal cardiologists, neonatologists. A lot of people will be working for his survival. There is a plan in place for resuscitation at University College London Hospital, where he will come into the world. Now Joshua's parents feel incredibly well cared for. When they get to the hospital, there are a few hours of preparation. Everyone's in their places. This is how it works. Joshua is born at 3:47 p.m, weighing 6 pounds 9 ounces, on the 26th of March 2017 by caesarean section, his dad holding his mum's hand in the hospital room. Though it lasts only 3 hours, his life after birth has 2 distinct stages to it: hope, then acceptance. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodge.